Hello, this will be a distillation of some of the thoughts and the information presented in my previous Keats video, which came out to about 36 minutes, and I thought it would be useful and convenient for anyone who might have been interested, but understandably wasn't willing to sit through a 36-minute ramble about this poet, uh, whom I very much admire. But if you're just being introduced to the subject, you might want something more concise. So I thought I would provide that for anyone who might be interested. Um, Rather than trying to begin dramatically like last time with a reading, I'll just go straight into his biography. So the big important thing in my mind to know about Keats' biography is that it's really short. He died at the age of only 25 of tuberculosis. And that's important to keep in mind for everything that he wrote, that all of it really is the poetry of a young man. There is arguably no mature Keats poetry or writing as such, which only makes what he did write so much more impressive and makes the idea of what he could have written had he lived longer that, tragic to consider. Um, Keats was the son of an ostler. That's the guy at the inn who watches the horses of the people staying there. Um, so he was no Lord Byron, right? He was not going to inherit a large sum of money. He was not a person of leisure who could write freely without having to worry about supporting himself by some other means. Keats did have to worry about supporting himself, and he did. He trained in medicine during his youth. He would have been considered an apothecary. That's a job that kind of blends aspects of what we would call a pharmacist and a doctor. But he did not remain with that profession after his apprenticeship in it. The same year that he got his apothecary license in 1816, he decided to quit, which was not a financially sound decision, but he decided to quit to devote himself entirely, completely to his poetry, his craft. And he was followed by money troubles for the rest of his pretty short life, in part because of this decision. Now, the other thing I think is important to keep in mind with Keats, at least as far as his biography or who he was as a person, is that he seems to have been a pretty good guy, which um, is it's unfortunate that it's remarkable as it is, right? And it's not so much that all of the romantic poets were assholes. You have a few very prominent examples of ones who were. But I think it's good to consider, especially because I think in this and some other ways, Keats serves as a really good counterbalance, if you will, with Lord Byron, as far as who embodies the romantic ideal. With Lord Byron, he kind of embodies one end of it, and Keats, to me, embodies another, where with Lord Byron, you have, of course, uh, the passion, the beautiful poetry, of course, but also this very like self-indulgent angst that a lot of that poetry flows outward from, which can be valuable in reading. But with Keats, you have this not exactly isolated, but introspective and dedicated artist. He was so completely devoted to his art and consumed by his identity as a poet. But at the same time, he wasn't so self-indulgent about it. He suffered for his art, but not needlessly. And he seems to have been, from everything that I've ever read of him, a really kind, caring person to the people in his life. One of the big um, reasons for his money troubles is that he made a large loan to one of his brothers, even while he himself had debts to pay off. And he contracted tuberculosis because he spent a year nursing his younger brother, who was sadly dying of tuberculosis. Um, so this was a man who balanced his identity as a poet with his essential humaneness, which I find just very compelling. Um, when he coughed up blood in 1820, his medical training and his experience watching family members die of tuberculosis, not only his younger brother, but also his mother and father, um, this, together with just his sight observation of the color of the blood he'd coughed, told him that he was going to die, and probably not before too long, right? Um, he had no real illusions about that fact. So, when he was advised to go to a warmer climate for his health, he did so, but I think, I'm speculating a bit here, but I think not so much for his health, because he already knew that was going to decline one way or another. Um, Instead, I believe he chose to leave England for Italy in order to spare his loved ones from having to watch him suffer and die. And in tuberculosis, I mean, the it's a pretty ugly disease to die of, right? I mean, not that there's a good disease to die of, but um, his lungs were essentially disintegrating inside of him, and the amount of suffering he was going to undergo, I think he wanted to spare some of the people in his life from watching that, as he'd had to watch in several cases. Especially his lover, Frances Fanny Brawne, um, who to whom he was never officially engaged for financial reasons, but they had been in love for some time. Uh, and on the ship that brought him to Italy, though he couldn't bring himself to write her any letters, I think he just wasn't emotionally equipped to do that at that time. He spent his time on the ship revising a sonnet that he had written her. This was the sonnet Bright Star. And this is a case in which, with Keats' work generally, but I think especially that poem in particular, having some knowledge of the poet's biography and the situation in which the poem is written really can enrich our reading. That's not always the case, I find, with poems or poets and writers, but here it really is. And I'm already getting emotional thinking about it. I hope that when I read Bright Star for you, I don't start tearing up, because I successfully avoided that in my previous video, but I get very passionate and emotional about Keats because when I'm talking about this, because I think he's such a striking, tragic figure. Um, so I have two sonnets that I'll go over, and for my detailed analysis of them, you might check out the earlier video that I posted, the longer one. So I'll just go over some quick notes here. But the first poem is a sonnet, When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be. This was written either before or just as he was starting to become sick. But I think before he had coughed blood, and therefore before he was certain that he was going to die soon, which I think is good to keep in mind because that makes what he's saying here pretty interesting from a biographical standpoint. So, when I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books in charactery hold like rich garners the full ripened grain, when I behold upon the night's starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance, and when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love. Then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. Now, throughout that poem, we have all these images and ideas of impermanence, right? The cloudy symbols that he might never live to trace. And when he feels fair creature of an hour, I think is it's a lovely phrase that communicates to us this idea of impermanence. When I have fears that I may cease to be, when he has fears that he will die before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before he's written all that he wants to, or perhaps before he's learned how to write the way he wants to about these things. Now, all of this comes to a close in the final couplet, as is expected in a traditional Shakespearean sonnet, which this is. It's following the Shakespearean pattern of an A-B rhyme scheme, with an ending couplet, 3 quatrains and a couplet at the end. And the last couplet is, it kind of carries on from the line before it, which is enjambed. So it goes, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. Now, love and fame are these impermanent things that he's been thinking of throughout the poem. But why do they sink to nothingness? What does he mean by that? I think it's a little mysterious in the poem. We might have to bring some of our own ideas to it. And in that way, it's not quite like a traditional sonnet, where normally the sonnet brings you through a logical argumentation almost of an idea and concludes with that idea having advanced to a greater point of understanding, to paraphrase John Fuller, who writes a great introduction to the Oxford Book of Sonnets, which I highly recommend to anyone who likes sonnets or poetry in general. It's pretty great. Now, in this poem, again, it's a little ambiguous in its ending. It can mean a few different things, which I think is interesting. But the larger point about it, I think, is that this poem is definitely concerned with death and impermanence, and especially it sounds like early death. So even before Keats knew he was going to die, at the young age of 25, I think having witnessed so much death in his life, and being aware of disease and the fragility of life as he was, having trained as a doctor and having watched family members die of tuberculosis, the same disease that would eventually kill him, I think it was something in his mind a lot. And here we can see almost an act of sublimation, I think, channeling that anxiety of death into something productive, at least in as much as it becomes this pretty beautiful poem, right? But the ambiguous ending kind of leaves a tension there with that anxiety, where it doesn't feel completely resolved, which I think makes it especially interesting that this was written before he had a pretty good certainty of death, because that contrasts it with Bright Star, which he wrote with the knowledge that he was going to die, and wrote it addressed to someone whom he understood he was never going to see again, someone whom he loved very deeply. Again, I'm starting to get emotional already, but I'll try to power through this. The poem Bright Star. Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art, not in lone splendor hung aloft the night, and watching with eternal lids apart, like nature's patient, sleepless eremite, the moving waters at their priest-like task of pure ablution round earth's human shores, or gazing on the new soft-fallen mask of snow upon the mountains and the moors. No, yet still steadfast, still unchangeable, pillowed upon my fair love's ripening breast, to feel forever its soft fall and swell, awake forever in a sweet unrest, still, still to hear her tender taken breath, and so live ever, or else swoon to death. I mean, that is remarkable. And again, we can imagine Keats on the ship bringing him to Italy, revising this beautiful sonnet that he'd written for Francis Braun, and the moving waters at their priest-like task of pure ablution round earth's human shore. We can imagine him feeling the motion of the waves rocking the ship, as he has all these thoughts of his own mortality and his aloneness, to which he, in some ways, consigned himself at the very end of his life, although he did have one friend accompanying him, Joseph Severn, I believe his name was. Still, still to hear her tender taken breath. He, in the first 8 lines, or 9 lines of the poem, gives us all these images suggesting death, but not in a morbid or grotesque way, in a very peaceful, almost resolute sort of way. There's a spirituality in it. In nature's patient, sleepless eremite. An eremite is a religious ascetic or a hermit, someone who separates themselves from the world for spiritual purposes. And we can think of him becoming separated from the world that he knows in 2 profound senses at this point in his life as he's writing this. But at the end of the poem, he brings us not to this idea of death so much as an idea of new life, of eternal life, still steadfast, still unchangeable, still, still to hear her tender taken breath, and so live ever. A kind of immortality in love, right? Pillowed upon his fair love's ripening breast. Ripening means to come into life. So there's a kind of life in death in this poem that I found, that I find really profound. And there's some repeated imagery across the 2 of them, too, right, which I find interesting. The stars and the shore. And the use of the word ripening as well. Whereas before, in the previous sonnet, he's worried that he won't be able to hold like rich garners the full ripened grain in the books that he hopes to write. But here he comes into ripeness through this affection for his for this loved one. Anyway, again, for a more detailed analysis, I go over that at greater length in my previous video, but for some concluding notes, Keats died in Rome, where he spent his last months of life, and at his request, his grave did not mark his name. Instead, he is identified on his gravestone only as a young English poet, which I think gets again at how consumed he was by his identity as a poet, how much of who he was taken up in his work, in his craft. Keats is still read, I think, simply because the poems are beautiful, right? That's the clearest, the most obvious reason to read his work. And other poets have dedicated to him their own poems, I think in recognition of this. So in that spirit, I wanted to append my own humble sonnet that I've addressed to him. It still needs some work, it still needs some revision, but such as these lines are, I will read them for you. Again, as I read them in my previous video, but I wanted to read them here as well. To Keats. Your name that touches not your own mute grave is graven not the less upon each heart, that hearkening to the sweetly sounding clave of measured rhythms issued through your art, are made with you to journey by the stars, partakers of an ancient company, co-victors of its garland prize. The oars timed by the song of your soul's errantry shall bring us by the track you speed us on, to find with you the prize of love in keeping. For beauty is our star, and love its dawn, not lessened by the pain of early reaping. We sail for love of beauty that is yours, your immortality, as love is ours. Okay, so I hope that is a good introduction to Keats for anyone who's not familiar with him. I hope that is interesting, and I see that I've shaved almost 16 minutes off of my original presentation of Keats. So I'll consider that a success. I quit while I'm ahead, and say goodbye now. Thank you.